Assassin's Creed is a series that spanned more than 15 years, and in that time, whoa, we're not going back to this. You have heard that same intro 1,000 different times, said in 1,000 different ways, over 100 different channels. Plus, we have a lot to do today, so let's skip the overbearing intros and jump right into it. Because today, we're going to be reviewing every single Assassin's Creed game in one video. I'd be remiss not to mention Cosmonaut Variety Hour, who essentially came up with this idea with his Ultimate Review series, and that's been going on like 7 years, and I don't think this is going to take any views away from him, so I'm okay taking inspiration. With all that being said, let's not faff about. Let's get right into it. Assassin's Creed is a game that's unapologetic in its commitment to creating a specific fantasy, the assassin fantasy. Unlike later games in the franchise that would go out of their way to make themselves accessible to the masses, Assassin's Creed decided on a clear and purposeful design structure and made it the absolute priority. From the moment the game was announced by Jade Raymond and her team, it was presented as something we'd never seen before, not in games or films, not in art or literature, an underrepresented sect of people in a forgotten time, being explored through the eyes of a modern escapee of a death cult. It's a pretty incredible premise, and it was solidified by a clearly defined gameplay interpretation, gameplay that was defined by its structure. This structure, the investigation system, was a mechanic that ensured the player had to consciously focus on each moment of gameplay, each interrogation, pickpocket or informant mission, in order to gain an understanding of your target as a person, and an understanding of how the world around that target will react to your presence. The structure wasn't based upon a linear set of predetermined outcomes, but instead on a dynamic world that you could uncover more information about to alter your tactics and strategies, allowing for the opportunity to have the most mindful experience playing one of these games, which, to be fair, isn't exactly the main goal of most average AC fans, but regardless, it's fantastic. Although some have claimed this gameplay loop to be repetitive or boring, I'd make the argument that it is only boring in so much as Red Dead Redemption 2 is boring, because the incentive of this gameplay loop isn't necessarily the missions themselves, but the context surrounding them. The reason why you're performing these actions is far more important than the actions themselves, similarly to an LA Noire, Red Dead Redemption 2, or even in certain cases, The Last of Us. This same assertion applies to the open world of AC1, which although on first impressions appears empty, especially in comparison to the future games, actually serves a greater purpose than simply filling the time for the player. Instead, the Holy Land acts as a backdrop for the linear story being told, a single expansive, interactive level in itself that once again gives additional context and atmosphere to the story being told. The purpose of this world, similarly to the purpose of its missions, is so unique from the rest of the industry that it often is misunderstood or criticized for not being something that it was never meant to be in the first place. That being said, Assassin's Creed 1 is inherently a narratively linear game. However, the fantasy of performing an assassination in any way you like, and in turn escaping in any way you like, wouldn't work within the confines of a completely linear level structure. The world is there only to feed into the story and journey of Altair, and if it did anything more than it does, it would take away from that focused story. This atmosphere provided by the world is added to with the inclusion of the only true social stealth mechanic we've seen in any of these games, in which your actions are truly, directly responsible for your notoriety. If you perform high-profile actions, whether it's eliminating someone in the line of sight of guards or simply running into a crowd, you'll immediately become a target of interest for the oppressive soldiers that reside within the city walls, walls that make you feel trapped and unwanted as is. These guards will further be alerted to your presence as the game progresses, and Altair's assassinations become common knowledge throughout the region, creating a notoriety that can't be dismantled by tearing down posters, but can only be made up for by changing your actions accordingly, becoming a law-abiding citizen in the eyes of your enemies. There is no quick fix in Assassin's Creed 1, and it's perhaps the most punishing of straying from socially acceptable actions, as the moment a guard locks onto you, it's chase time. There isn't a slow detection meter giving you time to get away here, no, this is all or nothing. This is all of course boosted by the fact that AC1 has by far the best dialogue in the entire series. Although it definitely has its occasional issues, it time and time again provides the most eloquent and nuanced representation of the Assassin-Templar conflict, of the debate of subjective versus objective morality, of the references to the Isu and to religious texts in this science fiction context. Altair's journey of redemption and of self-discovery is so carefully constructed, with vital information drip-fed throughout the game in a masterful fashion, to keep both him, Desmond, and the player guessing. Speaking of Desmond, the way in which the themes and motifs of the historical segments and modern day segments overlap create an entirely unique form of storytelling that can only be experienced within the medium of games, as the context Desmond gains from the diegetic world of the Animus feeds into his own reality, both thematically in conversation and physically by means of the bleeding effect, which reveals to him a smattering of blood on the walls of his prison that are lined with codes and messages that leave the game's cliffhanger as one of genuine intrigue. The game is a metatextual marvel that never fails to present a thought-provoking point in near enough every single line of dialogue, and its one-of-a-kind gameplay loop presented a fantasy that I fell in love with from the moment I first experienced it. Although it would be difficult to make the case that Assassin's Creed 1 is particularly accessible to the majority of players, the fact of the matter is it never tries to be. It only ever tries to appeal to those that it truly speaks to, which you can definitely argue is a flaw in the franchise's first entry, but as someone that this game does truly speak to, I can't call it anything except a masterpiece. Assassin's Creed 2 is an interesting game, still standing as the peak of this series' popularity despite some undeniable downgrades from the first. It most certainly appealed to a wider market, and perhaps most importantly, it was the catalyst for the best story in the entire medium of games. AC2 acts first and foremost as a phenomenal sequel to the story of Desmond, who after the cliffhanger of the first game is finally allowed free reign of the world after Lucy is forced to break him out of his Roman Abstergo prison, allowing us to get more perspective into the modern Assassin-Templar conflict, as well as establishing the overarching end of the world story that was alluded to in the cryptic emails of the first game. But we'll get to that, because although the modern day of AC2 is the perfect continuation of what came before, the far and away focus of this sequel is of course its historical focus, as it introduces who I consider to be the greatest fictional character of all time, Ezio Auditore, a boy who we see become a man over a 25-year span, as he travels across the whole of Italy to discover his place in the world, in a flawlessly executed hero's journey. We see Ezio in his arrogance as a young man be faced with an immediate surge of responsibility as his father and brothers are unlawfully killed, a responsibility that he initially takes on but is unable to understand the scale of until many years later, until he comes to terms with his desires for revenge and embraces a greater self-actualization. Despite the modern day continuing in such a flawless way, and the historical segment of this game providing the best example of a hero's journey we've seen in games, Assassin's Creed 2 does undoubtedly let itself down in its dichotomy between the two, as the thematic mirroring and the moral questioning of the first game becomes largely absent, as the Assassin-Templar conflict transforms from one of parallels and moral ambiguity to one of good and evil. Desmond resides in relative safety, and the motivation for exploring his memories is shakier than before, as the intention becomes to train Desmond to be an assassin via the bleeding effect. Definitely not the worst catalyst for an AC game, but not the most investment worthy. Luckily, this lack of substance in the modern day plot of 2 is made up for in droves of character, as the gang of Lucy, Desmond, Sean and Rebecca come together, a team that are dripping with charisma and chemistry, making every piece of optional dialogue an absolute joy to sit through. That being said, much of the overarching story of AC2 is contained within the fascinating and mysterious truth segments, which took the first game's critique of history and its mainstream version of events and began interweaving said real history into the story that was being built, of ancient civilizations, mind-altering technologies, and global conspiracies to gain power and control. Left by the mysterious Subject 16, these segments present an alternate reality to the stories of so many creation myths, namely that of the Bible's Genesis, which, given a basic understanding of history over the last 3,000 years, presents a premise that would entirely turn the world on its head, and by extension, immediately takes a vice grip on the player's imagination, allowing for the less casual fan to fully embrace the hidden lore sprinkled throughout the games. However, for casual players, the transition of the series into an adventure-filled hero's journey is is just as seamless a transition, with good reason for the countless analyses of this game across the internet. Speaking of which, if you want to see my entire breakdown of Ezio Auditore, check out my retrospective on all 3 of his games. It's not been seen by nearly enough people, and it's probably my best video to date. Aside from story, Assassin's Creed 2 also built on gameplay systems from AC1, for better or for worse. Whilst the combat takes a step up in variety, with a wider array of weapon types and a clearer integration of the combo kill, counter kill and dodge mechanics, the social stealth and notoriety systems are stripped of their depth and immersion, reducing what was an adaptive system that made you constantly stay conscious of your actions, down to a simple detection system that is no different from any other stealth game released around the time. Meanwhile, the concept of social stealth itself was reduced to simply standing in the middle of a crowd. Although the mechanic is still functional, engaging and immersive, it was undoubtedly stripped back in order to create a wider market appeal, a trend with Assassin's Creed 2 that was present throughout near enough every one of its respective parts, whether in combat, stealth, story, or even the more marketable historical period. No longer subject to the oppressive, harsh, war-ridden streets of the Holy Land, in the midst of a religious conflict, the player would now be open to the beautiful, vibrant world of Renaissance Italy, which certainly provided a new, unique experience. Although the atmosphere of the 4 Italian cities are diametrically opposed to those of the first game's 3, each region of AC2 provides a different purpose to Ezio's journey, which brings us back to what these early games did so well. Every single aspect of these games were purposeful, they served a central, unwavering focus, and they stayed consistent in that. Although Assassin's Creed 2 was undoubtedly a sidestep from what came before, it still fully understood what it was, and unapologetically provided that specific fantasy. It was a shift further into the public spotlight, a shift deeper into the action-adventure genre, but it's safe to say it was a shift that paid off, and gave us one of the most important action-adventure games to date. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is probably most famous for a parody trailer song made by an abusive transphobe. However, the game behind the trailer is considered, at least among hardcore circles of fans, the peak of the franchise. Serving a continuation of both Ezio and Desmond's story, Brotherhood was perhaps the first time in which gameplay truly took top priority, with its myriad of masterful missions sprinkling the gorgeous, atmospheric and engaging city of Rome. The inclusion of side content such as the courtesan missions, Thieves Guild, mercenary jobs, Leonardo's inventions, Romulus tombs, Christina missions, Templar hunts, Borgia towers, more truth segments from Subject 16, recruit missions, and each of the game's brilliant DLC all served as unique experiences that each had time and care put into them to craft memorable and differing experiences, and for the first time truly placed Assassin's Creed into the open world category of games. It feels like there was a chain that was broken with Brotherhood, as it stepped further out of the purely linear structures of the first 2 games, something that's exemplified even by the fact that you can replay missions in Brotherhood. However, unlike the games that preceded it, that often lent on underwhelming, irrelevant side content to expand their size and playtimes, every single piece of content that Brotherhood contains, similarly to AC1 and AC2, is included only to serve the main story, the growth of Ezio, the rebuilding of the Brotherhood, and the disintegration of Borgia influence in Rome. This united vision of every piece of content turns even the smallest of tasks into vital steps to achieving Ezio's overarching goal. Never is there a time in which you undertake a task feeling that it doesn't serve this central plot, and with it, the game's central themes and ideas of corruption, rebellion, and liberation. In this way, Brotherhood acts as a true expansion on what the first game established, in creating a world that was itself a character that is vitally interwoven with every player motivation. Although the game's design took an incredible leap with this entry, its base gameplay mechanics saw their least change, with the parkour returning with all of its previous precision, and the combat arguably taking a significant step back, as the introduction of the combo kill made each violent encounter a mindless process of repeatedly pressing a single button, a trend that tragically continued for the following 3 years. This simplification of the combat was another decision that expanded the target market of the franchise, by largely eliminating any skill gap for the game, as Ezio at the beginning of the game is just as strong a fighter as he is at the very end, just with a few extra gadgets. It's a shame that the progression becomes near enough non-existent, especially after it was an intrinsic narrative and gameplay element of the first game. However, this is a problem we see with character sequels all the time, as companies seem to have no idea how to continue progression, and instead like to just strip their characters of abilities they've already gotten. Which, by the way, reminds me that Batman Arkham does this flawlessly. As the games progress, you just keep all the abilities that you had in prior games, which is how it should always be, but alas, I mean, Rocksteady are just too good. That being said, this base gameplay system that carried over with it the gameplay loop of Assassin's Creed 2 was exactly what it needed to be, despite arbitrary arguments of repetition. It was around this time that people started claiming that Brotherhood was a lazy sequel for keeping the base mechanics the same, despite Uncharted, Batman Arkham, and God of War all doing the same thing, and rarely, if ever, getting criticised for it. It's hard to deny that Brotherhood missed the flawless mark that AC2 met in terms of storytelling, and had far from the razor-sharp writing of the first game, no doubt a result of limited development time and the creative director of the team leaving midway through development. However, Brotherhood still progresses each stem of the story in intensely meaningful ways, evolving Ezio into the mentor of the Brotherhood and putting Desmond up against his first roadblock in saving the world from the oncoming catastrophe. This is the most I've ever criticised this game, to be honest, and I'm really nitpicking in a lot of ways, because it's generally quite difficult to criticise this game. Its gameplay takes some steps back, but it's still built on the best system the series has seen, with the franchise's most iconic character in his prime, a modern day story at peak intrigue and storytelling, and a revolutionary open world. Brotherhood provides a unique experience in every moment it runs, and it's impossible to argue at this point that it isn't the best holistic Assassin's Creed experience on the market, even 13 years after release. Revelations is a game that shouldn't exist. A game that was originally intended to be a handheld side game to cap off Ezio's story, transformed in less than a year into one of the best entries into the franchise. Of course, this is helped by the fact that, again, it runs off the classic AC engine, and so its animations run in largely the same way as its predecessor, causing some players to get frustrated with the series' repetition. To me though, if something's not broken, there's no need to fix it, and Revelations merely adds on what is already a structurally flawless system, with its creation of the hook blade. The hook blade definitely has its ups and downs, no pun intended, as it undoubtedly increases the speed and fluidity of the parkour. However, it does make some mechanics such as side and back ejects less intrinsic to the experience. Whether it's better or worse can be argued, but it at least makes the experience unique. The same situation applies to the stealth system, which is kept largely the same, but is enhanced by the improvements in the bomb mechanic, which increases Ezio's arsenal from basic smoke bombs to a wide array of devices that can be used to distract, to destroy, and to manipulate, having a complete arsenal of bombs on top of all the other equipment Ezio's picked up over the years, which really does achieve the intended effect of making Ezio feel like the ultimate master assassin that at this point in his life, he is. But this ultimate master assassin can only go on for so long, as we see throughout the beautiful but at times inconsistent narrative that this game's hold. I say inconsistent because outside of its opening, the first few sequences of Revelations kind of suck. After the albeit brilliant first sequence in Masyaf, Ezio arrives in Constantinople and immediately does 5 tutorial missions, before then being treated to the most hilarious and out of place mechanic in AC ever, the infamous den defense, followed by a bizarre adventure with the Romanes who never get mentioned or come up in any other way for the rest of the game. After this strange start, the game is mostly clean sailing from chapter 4, with exquisite Darby McDevitt writing that pushes Ezio through the final stages of his hero's journey, out of his life as an assassin that he feared he'd be cursed with forever, as he comes to peace with what he's done, how he's lived his life and served his purpose, and finally is able to allow himself to fall in love again, and let go of what he once was. The presence of this poignant post-climax of Ezio's hero's journey definitely doesn't get as much screen time as it perhaps deserves though, but when it does, it fully showcases Darby McDevitt's character writing, a staple of the franchise that would go on to near enough define what it was to be a well-written Assassin's Creed game. Although that respective half of the story is ultimately perfect, the Assassin-Templar conflict is definitely less present than in previous games, at times feeling almost shoehorned in. But in spite of some plot contrivances, the characterization within these plot lines of the likes of Yusuf, Ahmet, Tarek and Manuel often make up for any lackluster story points. That really was the key of these early games. Even when the plot got slightly messy, or the pacing was slightly off, or the gameplay got mildly repetitive, it was always made up for by their astounding characterization, which made for a cast of characters in the Ezio trilogy especially that consistently left long-lasting impressions regardless of screen time. Paola, Bartolomeo, La Volpe, the Pazzi, the Barbarigo, the Medici, the Borgia, Claudia, Yusuf, Ahmet, Sofia, all of them are vital in making these stories poignant, which is a nice bit of meta praise considering they also become intrinsic to Ezio's own life as his surrogate family. The World of Revelations also flawlessly reflects Ezio's story of discovering more about the life of Altair, as the crossroads of the world symbolically represent both Ezio and Altair's people, Europe and the Middle East, meeting as one, which is exactly what happens in the game's iconic final scene, which plays on the modern day perfectly and sets up Desmond's grand mission in an unforgettable way. But then, it started getting weird. Looking at Assassin's Creed 3 in retrospect is difficult to do, because with the perspective of the series now, it stands as a relatively strong game that adheres to the identity of the series whilst incorporating its own unique mechanics and style that makes it stand out from its contemporaries. Wow, I think that's the nicest thing I've ever said about this game. But at the time, this was all covered up by the fact that this game was a downgrade from the games that preceded it in almost every conceivable way, and stood out as far and away the worst game in the series. AC3 has some visually stunning animation work, however it sacrificed a significant amount of player control for this visual upgrade. The parkour feels less responsive and the combat feels more like you're watching an interactive cutscene than engaging in a challenge. Every combat encounter feels like a QuickTime event without the flashing lights. When in a fight, you physically cannot eliminate an enemy until Connor's gone through the mandatory selection of animations to trigger a finisher, making it feel as if the player has little to no control over the outcomes of any events of the game, and are simply there to execute an inevitability, which similarly carries over to the parkour, which increases the strength of the animation snapping to the point where any kind of risk reward feels significantly diminished, and the game's obsession with keeping you safe becomes perniciously averse to a rewarding experience. Despite these specific issues just getting worse over the following years, AC3 began the downgrade, and still deserves criticism for it, even if it has been outdone recently. That all being said, I can't deny that Assassin's Creed 3 is at the very least a fun game that presents an entirely new perspective on the Assassin-Templar conflict and the Assassin fantasy as a whole, while staying in line with the original vision. Although there's perhaps less focus on investigation and assassination, the actions Connor undertakes to eliminate his Templar enemies are much grander and more dramatic, which almost feels thematically in line with this series' transition to the American Revolutionary War. The problem is that within the actual narrative of the game, that war becomes a bit too explicitly important. Now obviously, setting a game within the confines of the Revolution would lead to certain targets and historical figures being present, and that's not the issue. The issue is that Connor literally starts leading firing squads in a war atop a horse. If you don't see the issue with that, I don't really know how to explain it to you. The vast majority of this game aligns with the series' identity, but this type of thing is so dissonant with both that identity and Connor's apparent indifference to the squabblings of the English and the colonists that it completely breaks your immersion in both the game itself and in Connor's journey, as the story pauses all of a sudden to showcase a big historical event. This happens one too many times to not bring down the story pretty significantly, alongside the other major hindrance in this story's quality, the absolute bizarre and useless plot twist, in which it's revealed that the burning of Connor's village as a boy, which was presented as his driving motivation to join the Brotherhood and to hunt Templars, was actually ordered by George Washington, a life-altering revelation that results in essentially no response from Connor, who ignores Washington's involvement in the death of his own mother to continue hunting Charles Lee. This plot twist is so nonsensical that a lot of people seem to entirely miss it on their first playthrough of the game, as Connor's reaction is so non-responsive and it really throws a spanner into what could have been a much stronger story. There are shining diamonds within this pile of coal though. I don't know if that metaphor works, but we're gonna roll with it. Not since Assassin's Creed 1 had the dialogue been so thorough and intriguing, and it leads to some incredible back and forths, particularly between Connor and Haytham, as we watch the former grow out of his naivete, at least a little bit, over the course of their encounters. Speaking of Haytham, everything with him in the prologue of the game is undeniably excellent, and it's a shame he didn't get a game of his own, because in every scene he's in, he absolutely steals the show. Despite the at times shaky plot, this game is oftentimes held up with some of the best written conversations in the series. The story of AC3 definitely isn't as abysmal as it's sometimes made out to be, especially with the added context of the homestead missions, which, if they were included in the main plot, probably would have left this game much more fondly remembered by those who were disappointed by it. Speaking of which, there's also a surprising plethora of side content in Assassin's Creed 3 that, although never executed to perfection, is still interesting to engage in, whether it be the assassin recruit missions, the economy system, or the newly incorporated naval missions, which peak with the William Kidd treasure hunts that mirror assassin tombs. The game doesn't sell you short in terms of things to do. It's just a shame it wasn't as appreciated at the time of its release, thanks to the bar being set so high by what came before. Jesus Christ. I think I'm becoming an AC3 apologist. Speaking of strange games in retrospect, Black Flag stands as a turning point of sorts for this franchise, as despite universal acclaim, the game looms as the first Assassin's Creed that didn't prioritise the assassin fantasy. In fact, you spend the vast majority of Black Flag not playing as an assassin. Now, to be fair, this was made up for by two elements. The fact that the story was so excellently written in a way that portrayed the pirate and assassin philosophies as two sides of the same coin, so much so that I'd go as far as to say it's one of the game's most loyal to the creed and its thematic importance. Edward isn't simply a pirate who switches to become an assassin when it suits him. He is, in philosophy and in action, an assassin from the start of the game, but maintains a denial of the creed itself due to his own misunderstanding of what it is to say that nothing is true and that everything is permitted. Edward, meanwhile, embodies the creed in nearly all that he does, except for those actions driven purely by greed, his last vice that he's able to finally extinguish after he recognises the inevitable doom that it brings. Black Flag acts as yet another masterclass in characterization, not only of our protagonist, but of an entire supporting cast of pirates and assassins, each with personal driving motivations that oftentimes lead to the same end, and a bottleneck of plot points that purely feed into Edward's arc. Man, Darby McDevitt is a genius. However, the change in gameplay is the big controversy behind this game. Now, I won't deny that the gameplay often revolves around a number of assassin elements, including assassinations, eavesdrops, and tales. The focus this game places upon the pirate fantasy, however, was of course the first domino that started the knock-on effect to where we are now, with proto-assassins, Vikings, mercenaries, samurai, and everything else we've seen recently that refuses to acknowledge the title of this series. The resultant effect was of course terrible, but even in minute-to-minute gameplay, it brings the experience down, as the game gets suddenly halted so you can go bell diving, or searching for treasure, or hunting iguana to fashion holsters. The assassin elements that are there are built on, and in essence copy over directly from AC3, meaning that when those elements are prioritised, you still feel the downgrades that his predecessor implemented, and it's made even more awkward when those elements are merged with the pirate ones, making for a fucking hilarious tail mission in a battleship, which, to be fair, does end with the best chase mission in the entire series, but still, I simply don't feel sneaky when I'm tailing someone through a swamp in my pirate ship. I can't deny that it is easily the best pirate game ever made. Its naval combat systems, its sense of exploration, its cinematic combat, and its light RPG elements make you feel like a demon of the seven seas, building your fleet with the rewards of your pillaging. However, it is undeniable that it's not a great Assassin's Creed game, something that was clearly recognised by the AC community from the moment it came out, but to be honest was largely ignored due to the incredible writing of Edward's story, which, to be fair, is beautifully told. I'm not going to lie though, this game started the trend of disregard for inherent series markers, even including the modern day, which goes from the central focus and main storyline of the game to a 4-section set of first-person cutscenes that hold no gravitas or necessity. And it's left me now looking on Black Flag with more distaste than love. Assassin's Creed Rogue is the definition of a bang-average Assassin's Creed game, and that makes sense, as it still stands as the sad younger stepbrother of Assassin's Creed Unity, being Ubisoft's fallback option for previous-gen consoles back in 2014. It was perhaps the first game in the series that was explicitly made without any desire to push the series forward in gameplay or story, and that lack of inspiration shows, as its one selling point isn't even really utilised. It's been said before that Rogue is simply Black Flag with a new coat of paint, but that's too shallow a description. The game rips the combat, stealth, parkour and naval gameplay almost exactly from its predecessor, yes, but it transitions the context in a way that makes these mechanics lose their charm and specificity. When I sail a battleship in Black Flag, it's because I'm playing the role of a swashbuckling pirate. When I do it in Rogue, it's because Ubisoft had already developed the system and just couldn't waste it on one game. That's the thing about Rogue. Despite it not necessarily being particularly bad, having any level of awareness about how the game came to exist shatters all illusions of immersion or engagement. This game was made with the express intention of maximizing profits, and although every game in the series of course has that intention, it is the only intention of Rogue, making it feel almost counterfeit. This carries over to the story, where we see Shay tear down the colonial assassins before Connor rebuilds the Brotherhood, but this is meaningless prequel fodder. Shay didn't exist in AC3, and is written out of the Revolutionary War in as lazy a way as possible to make the timelines match up, essentially also that we can see Haytham and Achilles in the 7 Years' War. Even Haytham shooting Achilles in the leg instead of killing him, because suddenly Shay has an epiphany of mercy. It consistently pulls up the fourth wall and winks at the player about some piece of AC3 lore, and it's so frustrating. It also goes without saying that the switch from Assassin to Templar is an entirely vapid, superficial change that doesn't explore either group's philosophies with even the slightest bit of depth or intrigue, instead essentially swapping the roles of each order. Why do the Assassins have gangs in New York that fly flags with Assassin insignias? Why do they lead military quadrants and fight in the 7 Years' War? Because the Assassins in this game just do what the Templars do in the other games, whilst Shay undertakes every mission in an assassin fashion. And this whole conflict between Shay and the Assassins is because they refuse to take responsibility for murdering a city of people. That's not the Assassin Order. They can wear hoods and hidden blades, but they're not assassins. Why is Adewale killed in this game? Why is Achilles shot in the leg? Why does Shay go to kill Charles Dorian at the end? Not for any poignant narrative reasons, not for any overarching lore reasons, but simply because Ubisoft already had those assets to lean on, and so hoped that the recognizability factor of these moments would make up for the complete and utter absence of any substance. But that's not all, because Rogue becomes genuinely nonsensical in the modern day, in which you once again undertake the role of Abstergo employee, exploring the memories of Shay so that, and no, this isn't a joke, Otzoberg can cyberbully William Miles with pictures of dead assassins. I promise I'm not joking. That is actually the whole point of the game. Maybe calling Rogue bang average was a bit of an overstatement. This shit sucks. What can I say about Assassin's Creed Unity that hasn't already been said in 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different people? I could talk about how it was a broken, buggy mess on release, how the patches cured my grandmother's cancer, how the black box missions are the best piece of content in the entire Assassin's Creed franchise, how Arno's story is messy, but how the DLC makes it so much better, about the beautiful one-to-one recreation of Paris that is built with freedom of movement as the #1 priority and blending with crowds as the second, but how neither of these mechanics function quite as well as they should have, despite the world being built so flawlessly for them. I could talk about how the plot should have been reordered, about how the themes of Dogma and the critiques of the Creed could have been pulled off so much better if they had just put the Bellex betrayal as the final climax. I could remind you of the mountains of quality side content that fill the dense world that vary from murder mysteries, riddles, stories involving the biggest names in Paris, co-op missions that flesh out the revolution and the assassin's role in it. I could describe the extensive customization system and how it too would have been perfect had it not been infected with the first major batch of Ubisoft microtransactions. I could talk for hours about how this game is the best Assassin's Creed entry of all time in concept, but in execution lets down in so many ways, about how the series could have been revolutionary had it continued to build and flesh out the systems of Unity, about how magnificent this game would have been had it been given another year in development. But of course, that's all been spoken about already. So let's move on. Wait, no, go back, please. We were so close to greatness. Unfortunately though, Ubisoft decided with Assassin's Creed Syndicate to strip back and undo all the elements of Unity that made it so close to perfect, starting first and foremost with the world. There's a reason that a World War II or Wild West Assassin's Creed game wouldn't work, and that's because the closer you get to the modern day, the less a traditional assassin can fit within the context of the game world, and that's the case even with Syndicate. London in the late 19th century was, with no sense of exaggeration, the biggest and most important city in the world. It was the financial hub of the world, and it was the centre of the world's greatest powers. So the fact that two assassins from Crawley, who are at no point shown to be particularly exceptional, simply decide one day to go to London and proceed to take over the power structures of the entire city in 6 months is mind-boggling. Now, the reason that this story had to take place over the span of 6 months is because at this time, technology and with it the makeup of the city was changing so rapidly, but of course, Ubi couldn't invest the time in building a world that changes and evolves. That right belongs to Rockstar. Not only do they take control of half the industries in the city by making a gang that wears all green, which again isn't actually ever really explained, but is simply built from a menu screen, they also take this control from an apparently world-famous businessman named Crawford Starrick, who is of course a completely fictional character. Because this time period is so recent, it couldn't be risked that someone's great-granddad was made the villain of this game. But of course, this completely contradicts the whole idea of Assassin's Creed conceptually that was established in the very first game, that the history books aren't as they seem, and that the true history behind historical figures and their allegiances take place within an untold war. This concept works when it's a group of Crusade-era Templars, or a group of Italian nobles led by the Borgia family, or even a sect of English sympathizers in the colonies, but it doesn't work so well with an order of entirely fictional, one-dimensional caricatures who have no real philosophical ponderings that go further than capitalism is good. This bizarre set of characters that reside in a completely fictionalized version of industrial London make the entire game feel like a parody, a satire of classic Assassin's Creed with color-coded gangs, top hats, a Looney Tunes-esque combat system, a Batman rope launcher, a magical healing cloth kept in a royal tomb, and a literal mustache-twirling capitalist as the main antagonist. This isn't helped with Jacob, potentially my least favourite character of all time, cracking fourth wall breaking quips every third sentence, as if he's actually laughing and pointing at the parody that is this game's concept. That all being said, there is one place where Syndicate does get my ultimate praise, because in spite of all its abysmally lame elements, Assassin's Creed Syndicate has the best stealth system in the entire series, with easily the best selection of stealth missions in the entire series, and it's absolutely heartbreaking that you have to go through the entire experience of this game to experience these masterful black box missions. But they are there, and as much as it makes me a little sick to say, I would be remiss not to mention them. I can't say the same though for the combat, which has been parroted multiple times as the embodied experience of beating someone to death with your car keys, and that Walshy-born phrase has caught on because it's such a perfect description. A lot of people despise the combat of Odyssey due to its damage sponge, tedious nature, but Syndicate was just a slightly less egregious predecessor to that exhaustive system, as it combines an unbalanced leveling system with the animation-based approach of the mid-2010 games, to create what I consider to be one of the worst combat systems ever developed in any AAA game ever. To be honest, Syndicate is a lot closer to the RPG games than most people want to admit, and although it retains the hoods and hidden blades, it disregards the rest of the franchise's soul in place for a quick attempt to recoup the losses of Unity. And even in that, it failed miserably. 2017 in retrospect was an absolutely bizarre time to be an Assassin's Creed fan, but at the time it was phenomenal. After Unity and Syndicate both let us down, we had the first year off from the series in years, with promises of a soft reboot that would revive the series completely, and so for a year straight, this community was united in hypothesizing and imagining what we could see from the leaked Assassin's Creed empire. RPG elements, tombs, fleshed out side missions, an origin story of the Brotherhood, a huge sprawling open world with dynamic environment and population. It sounded amazing. And that is what we got in Assassin's Creed Origins, a game that at its release garnered near universal praise and admiration from Assassin's Creed fans. It had apparently lived up to the hype, or at least that's what we thought, as over the following years, the game was analysed, critiqued, and our blinding desires for a great AC game were overpowered by genuine observations of Origins for what it was. Half-baked. Origins was a game that implemented all of these interesting systems but didn't fully commit to any of them. It was an origin story that barely told the origins of the Brotherhood or of the Creed. It was an RPG, but still maintained the linear structuring. It was an Assassin's Creed game, but refused to address the Assassin's Creed. It had a beautiful open world that was filled with cookie-cutter activities, and it was a revival of the modern day whilst only implying a modern narrative. The same team that made Black Flag, a team we all thought understood the series, came in and did exactly what they did with Black Flag. They stripped Origins of its identity as an AC game, not quite enough to be a deal breaker, but just enough to start a chain of events that would be disastrous for the franchise's reputation. If you want to talk about the mechanics of Origins themselves, it's a case similarly to Unity, where things work better in theory, whether you're talking about the repetitive structure of missions, or the single button climb everything parkour that both respectively provide mindless experiences. The hunting and crafting designed to make a more immersive open world, in fact make a more tedious open world, especially as single-hit assassinations become locked behind a gate built of steel and animal hides. And of course, the stealth, although largely maintaining the spectacular environmental elements of Unity and Syndicate, destroyed the single unique gameplay element of the series in social stealth, which I see as a metaphor for a destruction of the series itself. But this isn't a review of how Origins affected the series as a whole. I've already made that video. This is a review of Origins as a game in itself, and it really is a complete disappointment. Despite a generational performance by Abubakar Salim, it's contained within a nonsensical narrative that structure and plot points fall apart at even the slightest analysis, epitomised by the main villain and leader of the Order of the Ancients being revealed to be a character that most players didn't even know had appeared already. The story is an absolute mess that leaps between characters and misses out key development, as major events such as the creation of the Brotherhood happen simply because they need to. And I'm still convinced that the writers of this game don't know what the word Creed means. Origins was underwhelming at best, but it was nothing compared to what would come next. I don't know if I've ever fully given my thoughts about Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but I ought to do my due diligence here. Odyssey is an absolute joke of a game. Developed by the same team responsible for Syndicate, it carries over the impression that it's a complete parody of the series. However, to compound this issue, it strips the series completely of any of its identity, removing assassins, removing Templars, and diluting the franchise down to an ancient Greece simulator, and a bad one at that. Following up Origins, it slammed on the accelerator to reboot the series as an RPG, fully leaning into the underdeveloped RPG elements of Origins without refining them enough for them to be so inherent to the experience, creating one of the most unbalanced leveling systems ever put to this medium, with arbitrary experience points reaching the hundreds of thousands in the later stages of the game and barely making a dent in your character's actual growth and improvement, as every battle swiftly descends into button mashing tedium, with automatically level scaled enemies that, instead of having any skill or power that exceeds the player, simply have near infinitely extended health bars that you have to whittle down. This also causes a complete annihilation of the concept of assassinations, as stealth attacks, which are no longer one-hit kills at this point, become nigh useless unless you're massively over-leveled, which, as I already mentioned, is impossible because level scaling is on by default. And that's all without mentioning the passionless, traitless, characterless husk of a protagonist that you're given with Cassandra, who has no discernible character traits due to the half-baked yet intrinsically important dialogue choice mechanic, which allows Cassandra to be a bipolar maniac who can one minute save a town, the next can kill everyone in that town, and the next can cuck out an old man in one of the most poignant examples of, and yes, I'm going to say it, ludonarrative dissonance I have ever seen. On top of that, these dialogue choices and the faux choice of the character at the start of the game fundamentally break the lore established for 11 years at the point of Odyssey's release and completely undo the fascinating sci-fi elements that lay at the heart of what Assassin's Creed was. Not to mention that this illusion of player choice also led Ubisoft to a homophobic controversy when the game, after preaching to you that you can choose to make Cassandra gay, forces her to have a child and a heterosexual relationship, which to me perfectly demonstrates just how abysmal this game is both conceptually and in practice. The world of Greece is hollow. The gameplay is endlessly tedious and soul-sucking, and at times, money-sucking. The structure is built around pushing microtransactions. The protagonist is an empty husk. The story is mediocre at best. The DLC decimates the lore and ignores historical accuracy by multiple millennia. The soundtrack is revolting. Oh, and have I mentioned, you don't play as a fucking assassin. Wow. I really needed to get that out. And now I'm going to seem like a complete hypocrite, because I still quite like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I know is a hot take amongst most of the Assassin's Creed community and the gaming community as a whole. However, although it shares a lot of the issues with Odyssey, although it doesn't include an assassin as the protagonist, I am far more forgiving to Valhalla, as a lot of its other elements are balanced out. Its leveling isn't quite as outrageous, its world is more interesting and built up, and it takes itself seriously. But most importantly, its story is absolutely excellent. Whether you want to look at the story of Eivor, Sigurd and Basim in England, or even better, the story of Layla Hassan in the modern day, putting the stopper on a narrative thread that, whether accidentally or on purpose, was set up 10 years prior, and stands as the only continuous narrative thread that Ubisoft have actually finished. You could very well argue that Valhalla tries to be too many things at once, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree, as it's a game that, unlike AC1, has no clear idea what it is. However, the game is so big that regardless of what you're looking for from an Assassin's Creed game, you can find it. Interesting history? There. Viking fantasy? There. Assassin elements? There. Great story? There. Fascinating and active modern day? There. New and meaningful Isu lore? There. Yes, the game has major structural issues that I outline in my full review, and it is far too long. But to me, there's more than enough sparks of brilliance within this game to put it on the same level as Odyssey. To put it very simply, Valhalla is what it was sold as, which was a step up from Origins and Odyssey, both in terms of being a game and in terms of being an Assassin's Creed game. Don't get me wrong, it's still bad. It's just far and away the best of a group of terrible entries. And that is every single Assassin's Creed game reviewed in one single video. And yes, that is every Assassin's Creed game. I'm not doing Liberation. Now, I have no doubt that everyone is going to ask me to rank these games now, because after all, that's kind of what I'm known for on YouTube, as well as retiring like 4 times a year. And I've not listed out the games in order in 2 years. So, to satiate all of your burning desires, here we go. At 12, we have Assassin's Creed Syndicate, a spit in the face to the Assassin's Creed franchise. At 11, Odyssey, a disaster of an RPG and an even worse Assassin's Creed game. At 10, we have Rogue, potentially the most mediocre game I've ever played. At 9, Origins, a game that was just a head writer away from being incredible. At 8, Valhalla, a game that knows it isn't Assassin's Creed, but still tries. Oh, and written by Darby McDevitt. At 7, Unity, the best Assassin's Creed game ever made if it had another year's development. At 6, Assassin's Creed 3, a game that became better due to the failures of what came after it. At 5, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, a game that strays from what it should be, but does everything so well that it can't be criticised for it. At 4, we have Assassin's Creed 2, a legendary narrative contained within a foundationally sound structure. At number 3, Revelations, a perfect culmination of a story that spans a millennium. At number 2, Assassin's Creed 1, a piece of art that knows what it is and refuses to elaborate. And finally, the best Assassin's Creed game ever made, now and forever, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, a flawless combination of atmosphere, design, world, gameplay, story, content, created in a 9-month span, but built to be remembered forever. And with that, everyone's going to forget everything I've said in this video now and just argue about the rankings in the comments down below, but let me know what you think. What's your ranking of the series? What do you think of the reviews of each game? Let me know. If you enjoyed the video, it would really be appreciated if you could hit like, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe with post notifications turned on. Oh, and I just quickly also want to apologize for any long-term viewers or fans. My content over the last year has been fucking all over the place and a little bit dog shit. I tried making videos using AI, which was a bad, immoral idea. So yeah, I just wanted to say I've been a bit confused about what this channel is. and what this channel can be, but I hope this video shows you all that we're headed in the right direction. With all that being said, I've been Joe, aka Found a Scarab. My light has turned off, so I will see you in the next one.